I am Elise Adler. I work for the Nashville Public Library, so it is my pleasure to be able to say welcome and thank you so much for coming to our kickoff of the 2013 Nashville Reads, our citywide reading initiative, and we are so thrilled to have Yann Martel here with us and so excited to read Life of Pi as a city. Some of you are reading it for the first time, and some of us are reading it for the second, third, or maybe even fourth time. Nashville Reads, as so many of our programs are, I mean, they are not just the work of one person, they're not even the work of one organization. They really come to you in a successful way because of the strong partnerships and terrific collaborations that we have. And in this case, it's Nashville Public Library, Humanities Tennessee, Parnassus Books, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, the Mayor's Office, the Nashville Public Library Foundation, and the Friends of the Nashville Public Library. So, you know, I say this often, and it's true, it really does take a village, and I want to say thank you so much to each and every person who has helped us create this initiative in the city. I also want to say thank you to Michael Lusk and Clint and the people who do the AV and all the volunteers that we have today. Thank you very much. If you would like to applaud for them, you may do so. That would be nice. And this year for our 2013 Nashville Reads, I also want to say, I'm not going to list them all because we'd be here all day, but we have so many wonderful community partners. We have organizations and individuals, all of whom are helping us create different activities over the next 6 weeks in order to provide for you all these wonderful experiences around the title Life of Pi. I hope that you have a card in hand, or if you don't, we'll be sure that you have one before you leave, of many of the activities that are already confirmed, because they are really fun, they are really diverse, and we want you to know. You can also always check our website at library.nashville.org/Nashville Reads. And it's great for you to do that for two reasons. One, you'll have up-to-the-minute information about all the activities that are going to be happening, and you can also interact with us. And when you interact with us, through our website, you are put in a drawing for some really great prizes. And you'll read reviews, and there's all kinds of fun stuff. You'll just have to check it out. And follow us on Twitter, because there'll be all kinds of information, or like us on Facebook. So to introduce our guest of honor, we have one of the city's greatest proponents of reading. He's an avid reader himself. He is such a strong supporter of education, of lifelong learning, and of libraries. And it is always a pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you our wonderful mayor, Carl Dean.
Well, good afternoon. It was nearly a year ago that I announced our first Nashville Reads project, Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale. Nashville Reads is a simple call to everyone in Nashville to read the same book at the same time and to take a moment to share ideas with others. Nashville Reads gives us an easy way to connect with the diverse people we encounter every day here in our home, Nashville. I'm excited to join you today to kick off Nashville Read 2013, reading Yann Martel's award-winning book, The Life of Pi. The Life of Pi is a perfect choice for Nashville Reads. It is truly readable by and interesting to adults and youth, diverse men and women, and will spark conversation and connection across our city. Like Handmaid's Tale, Life of Pi unfolds in a very different place, but raises topics and questions relevant to us here today, such as coexistence of religions, imagination and evidence, ethics and survival, humans' treatment of one another, and treatment of other species. I invite everyone in Nashville, from middle school students to adults, to join me in reading Life of Pi and participating in at least one of our great community events and talking about the book or the questions it sparks with your neighbors, coworkers, friends, and strangers. I look forward to our literary journey together. Please join me in giving heartfelt thanks to the library, the Library Foundation, Parnassus Books, Humanities Tennessee, Houghton Mifflin, Friends of the Library for their good work in bringing author Yann Martel to Nashville and making Nashville Reads happen again in 2013. It is truly an honor for Nashville to host Yann Martel. His Life of Pi is a treasure of our time. It was rightly called extraordinary by the New York Times. I can personally attest to the story's ability to burrow into your mind and demand contemplation well after you think you've finished reading it. I finished reading it about 3 weeks ago, and I woke up that night at around 3 in the morning thinking about the ending, which I won't tell you what I was thinking, but I had to resolve something in my mind, and I laid in bed for about an hour thinking about it, and I resolved it in my mind, and you will too. After winning the Man Booker Prize for Life of Pi, Mr. Martel continued challenging himself and readers with works including The Surreal Beatrice and Virgil and What is Stephen Harper Reading?, his collection of letters to Canada's Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. Now please join me in giving a very warm Nashville welcome to Yann Martel.
Thank you very much, Mayor Dean, for that wonderful introduction. I have to say I'm amazed that you have the luck of having a mayor who was so involved in literacy and in reading and who was himself a reader. In Canada, like in many parts of the United States, there's a huge disconnect between the artisans of culture and our political class, and it's to the detriment of our country and to yours. So you're lucky in Nashville to have that kind of cohesion between these two forces. So today we have about an hour or so, and there's a lot I want to do. I'm not going to read from the book, because I thought the most useful thing I could do with you is explain to you how I came to write Life of Pi. First of all, can I get a sense, how many people have read the book? Because I'm going to kind of, okay, good, because I'm going to, for those of you who haven't, I'm going to slightly ruin it for you. So afterwards, we're going to have a question period. Feel free to ask any questions you want. I'll cover a number of topics, but let me start to explain how I wrote Life of Pi. So Life of Pi was my third book. The first book was a collection of short stories, and then I wrote a novel. And they had good reviews, very poor sales. Welcome to the world of literary fiction. And the author's note in Life of Pi is mostly true. I went to India meaning to work on a novel set in Portugal, which in fact is the novel I'm working on right now. I finally figured out how to tell it. But at that time, in my early 30s, or mid-30s, when I got to India, the novel didn't come alive. I put it aside because it just wasn't working. Those of you who write here know when your words seem to come alive and they just flow and there's a deep sense of joy at creating something. That was not happening. So I put it aside. And I'd gone to India strictly because I'd been there once before following a girl, a beautiful girl who invited me to come to India. I knew nothing about India. I'd read a few of the great Anglo-Indian novels, E.M. Forster and like that. So I'd gone there the first time and I'd fallen in love with this country. It's a wild, crazy country, India. It's the largest democracy in the world, one of the oldest civilizations on earth. It's an extraordinary country of contrasts. You see the best and the worst of humanity in one continent. It's sort of all of life in one place at one time. So that first time I'd been struck by it. And so I decided when I was working on this Portuguese novel to go there, just because it was, by Western standards, a very inexpensive place to be. So I envisioned myself setting myself up somewhere comfortable and exotic, and that being sort of a stimulus for this novel that was entirely set in Portugal, had nothing to do with India. But as I said, the novel died, and suddenly here I was with very little money. I didn't have much money. In India, when I didn't mean to be a tourist. I wasn't going there just to be a tourist. I was going there to construct a novel. But there I was with nothing to do. And then a curious thing happened. I adapted. Like all animals, I adapted to my circumstances. And my circumstances were India. And what happened is, for the first time in my life, I opened myself up to two things: animals and religion. Religion, I have to quickly explain my background. I'm from Quebec, from French Canada, which traditionally was a very Catholic society. And then there's a curious phenomenon that happened in the early 60s that came to be called the Quiet Revolution. And what happened during the Quiet Revolution in Quebec is literally the entire province abandoned its faith, abandoned the church. And it happened it just happened. There was no necessarily significant beginning moment. It was just a sudden realization that there was no need to be so hidebound to a particularly traditional form of Catholicism that was frustrating many, many people in the province intellectually and emotionally. So very quickly, the churches emptied themselves of their congregations, even priests defrocked. And the province suddenly went from being this extremely traditional, backward kind of place to being the most socially progressive province in Canada, which it is still to this day. It is still the most socially democratic province in Canada. But as a result of that, a whole generation of people grew up who were fiercely anti-secular, anti-religious. And my parents were children of that revolution, and in a sense I was a grandchild of it. So growing up, I grew up in a household that was completely a-religious. If religion was ever discussed, it was sort of in anthropological terms. There are people in Papua New Guinea who wear naked and have little bones through their noses. Well, Catholics, in a sense, are no different. They're just this curious manifestation of beliefs done by certain tribes of the world. And that was fine. What replaced what religion is supposed to do for people, give them a sense of meaning, a sense of context, a sense of direction, what replaced that in my family, as in many households in Canada, was art. You remove Jesus and Buddha and Allah, and you replace it with Picasso, Mozart. And, that was, growing up, that was my way. And it is to many millions and millions and millions of Westerners, their way of understanding life. You understand light through great art. Art explains suffering. Art explains who we are, why we are, what we want to be. We dream through art. And so I grew up with art. I grew up reading, being dragged by my parents to visual arts. And in fact, this morning I had a wonderful visit of the Frist Center for the Arts. So that was in a sense how I understood my world, was through art. And then I got to India, and by the time I was I think I was 33. And also, so I should back up, I was quite good at school. I was fairly bright at school. And by the time I got to India, age 33, I suddenly discovered that I was tired of being reasonable. When you're bright, especially when you're a male, you're encouraged to be reasonable. Rationality is an extraordinarily empowering tool, right? I mean, this sound system is the result of attention to detail and the application of reason. The lights here, everything basically in this room is the result of technology, and we appreciate that. And so I was taught at university to be reasonable, to apply the criterions of rationality to everything around me. But what I ultimately found, and it took this trip to India for me to discover this, was that I was tired of being reasonable. In a sense, it wasn't getting me anywhere. What this excessive use of rationalism was doing is it was basically wiping away any kind of magical thinking in my life. Now, that was fine in terms of religion. I felt I had no interest in religion. I knew, like most people who don't like religion, I knew just enough to hate it. So Catholicism is homophobic, anti-Semitic, patriarchal, all of it was just completely true. I'm not defending the Catholic Church, but that's all I knew about it. I knew enough to think it was for children or ill-educated people. So I was doing very well without religion. But I was also finding that being excessively reasonable was starting to affect my appreciation of the arts. And being myself a writer, that was obviously problematic. And in fact, I think that's... I had a separate campaign with the Prime Minister of Canada. Mayor Dean just referred to that. For 4 years, I sent the Prime Minister of Canada a book every 2 weeks. Usually, always a book of fiction, a novel, poems, plays, graphic novels, children's stories. Because Stephen Harper is one of these bright men who, in a sense, what happened to him, but far worse, is what happened to me. Excessive reason has killed off any magical thinking in his mind. And he's a man who has stopped reading entirely since his early 20s. He obviously reads reports, but books, he hardly reads books, and he never reads fiction. And to my mind, that's a danger. The novel is one of the great products of the West. You want to understand Russia in the 19th century, you read Russian literature. You read Dostoevsky, Gogol, Tolstoy. To read literature is a wonderful way to be someone else somewhere else, and you get some of that life wisdom that you get from being somewhere else, someone else. It's a way of traveling to read. And I think what happened with Stephen Harper was this notion that a novel isn't real. Wizard of Oz isn't real. Dorothy didn't get swept up in a storm to Oz. So if it's not real, therefore it can't be very true, and therefore why read it? Which, of course, is a tragic misunderstanding of what fiction is about. Artists invent precisely to get to a truth. And so because of that, Stephen Harper stopped reading. And therefore we have a man who's a very shrunken sort of man with a very narrow vision. That, in a sense, was starting to happen to me in India. And then I got to India, and because I had no novel to work on, I noticed all this stuff in front of me. And one of them, for the first time, was religion. Because religion, less so now, unfortunately, because of politics and the politicization of religion, but until a few decades ago, religion was relatively a benign force in India. I am slightly idealizing it, but was relatively a benign force. And despite the poverty in India and the great level of tension in the country, it's remarkable how all these religions coexist. Now, that has something to do with the nature of Hinduism, which is not an exclusive religion. It's not a religion that feels it owns all the truth. Hindus believe everything is a manifestation of the divine, in a sense like with Islam, but they name every single little manifestation of the divine with a different name. And so when Christians first came to India, unlike the experience of Christian missionaries in Japan, where they were fiercely persecuted, when they came to India, the Hindus, the locals, thought, oh, well, this Jesus doesn't sound so different in his personality from Krishna. So there's no sense of threat. So the idea was that, Christians, well, you're God, well, just join the pantheon. One more God, no problem. We have millions of them, welcome to the club. So there was never that history of persecution in India that you have in other countries. And so I had suddenly in front of me all these religions and their extraordinarily varied manifestations. I mean, if you look at the manifestations of Christianity next to Hinduism, next to Islam, next to Buddhism, next to Jainism, Judaism, animism, they're all there in India. I suddenly started noticing them. And for the very first time in my life, I was intrigued by it. I wasn't seeing, oh, pity they're religious, that's holding them back. I stopped being so judgmental, and I started seeing as, how is it that in, this was actually the early 21st century, how is it that so early in the 20th century, after all the triumphs of science and technology, after the analysis of history by Karl Marx, after, Darwin and Charles Lyell, how are there still people who have this odd thing called religious faith? And I became intrigued. So right away I had this idea of, just for the sake of artistic research, I had this idea of writing a novel featuring a character who had faith. Because the books that I've written have always been an attempt to understand something that I don't understand. It's my way of exploring, my way of staying at school. So Beatrice and Virgil was my attempt to understand the Holocaust. Self, my first novel, which wasn't published in the United States, very small sales, was my attempt to understand sexual politics. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? How do the two meet? How does that map over with sexual orientation? And my first book, Collection of Stories, was my attempt to understand the very nature of storytelling. Why do we tell each other stories? What makes for a story? So each one was an attempt to understand something. So with Life of Pi, I thought, I'm suddenly intrigued by faith. Because not all those people out there who are faithful are psychotic, are out to oppress someone else. People like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, to take two examples of people who are very, very religious and are okay with the secular crowd. I was intrigued looking at that kind of faith, the non-judgmental kind of faith. And at the same time, I noticed in India, and this is a more banal observation, I noticed the presence of animals. Obviously, Canada is a temperate country. We don't see as many animals as you do in a tropical country like India. Famously in India, you see cows in the big city, roaming the big cities. The cow is sacred in Hinduism. Now, it's a very hard-working divinity, frankly, the cow in India, but nonetheless, they are not harmed, they are not confined, so they wander the streets, and so you have these spectacularly weird scenes where you'll have a roundabout with a million vehicles swirling about, and any human being who runs across will get run over, and then very placidly a cow starts crossing that roundabout, and you have cars, trucks, buses, those three-wheeled things, tuk-tuks, swerving to avoid the cow, because if you're a Hindu, you really do not want to run over a cow. That's so much bad karma. So you have this cow just placidly crossing, as if it were crossing a field, crossing this busy, busy roundabout of traffic. So that was very striking for a Westerner from a temperate country. And there's because it's a tropical country, you see monkeys, you see rats, you see goats, you see pigs, you see lots of animals. And beyond that, in Hinduism, unlike in Christianity, where there's very few animals, and they're there only for symbolic purposes, when Jesus tells Peter that he would betray him before morning, the cock crowing 3 times it's a timepiece. The crow is not the rooster is not symbolizing roosterhood. He's just a timepiece. And Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. The donkey isn't representing donkeyhood, it's representing modesty. Romans ride on horses. Jesus comes riding on a donkey because it's more modest. So the animals there are just symbols of something else. Largely in Christianity, animals are quite absent. They're very present in the New Testament, strangely absent in the New Testament. Well, in Hinduism, it's full of animals. Ganesh, one of the divinities of Hinduism, has the head of an elephant. Hanuman, who's a sort of a demigod, is a monkey. All of the gods have an animal carrier, a means of transportation that is an animal. So Vishnu has Ganesh, bizarrely being a large and big head, big body, has a rat. So in front of every Ganesh temple in India, in front of the entrance, you'll have a small sculpture of a rat. Vishnu has a Nandi, who is a bull, quite a large bull. In front of every Vishnu temple, you'll see. So it's not Vishnu. It's anyway. You'll have a large sculpture of Nandi the bull. So in Hinduism also, you have lots and lots of animals. And for the first time in my life, because until then, as a typical child, I had animals in my life, but all domesticated ones, onto whom I projected all kinds of things. Often people who have pets. I'm sure people in this audience here, you talk to your animal every morning. You talk to your cat, you talk to your dog. Well, I hate to inform you, but your cat, your dog doesn't speak English. But you do, you project onto it, and that's what we do. That's how we, in a sense, humanize that animal and make it part of our lives. For the first time in India, and I don't know why I did this, I looked at animals and I tried to look at them on their own terms. Not how they could serve me, not how they were projections that comforted me or scared me, but just on their own terms. And those 2 things that I noticed happened sort of at the same time. I noticed faith and I noticed animals. And by bizarre alchemy, they came together. I had this idea of telling this story. And it was there right at the start, this idea of telling a story with a boy in a lifeboat with an animal. And right away in my mind, it was clear what I was doing. That lifeboat was going to represent the human condition. And the inhabitants of that lifeboat were going to represent the various elements of the human being. So Pi and his religiosity represents one extreme of our condition, that capacity to imagine extraordinary realities, which was way beyond what any animal can do. And I specifically chose religion in part, as I said, because I suddenly was intrigued by it, but also because we can imagine in many, many ways. We have scientific imaginations, artistic imaginations, but I think the one that really goes to the limits of what we can imagine is religion. Religion leaves us far behind rationality as any worked out act of the imagination of our species. So that's one extreme of our human condition. And the other, the one in which we're firmly rooted, is our animal condition. We are animals. We are biologically animals. We are subject to many of the same fears that animals are. We sometimes, in moments of fear, we become very animal-like. Our level of aggression, our territoriality, all of those you can see echoed in the animal kingdom. So here we are this very odd species where we have this extraordinary capacity to reach the limit of what can possibly be thought, but yet firmly rooted in this very incarnated animal. We are mammals. We are, in a sense, no different from whales and baboons, and we're all that same. We're all connected in some ways, and yet we're different. And so I saw this lifeboat as this wonderful metaphor to represent who we are. So when I sign books, by the way, I often will write, may you reach the coast of Mexico, which is not just wishing you a holiday when it's warm, for example, or when the weather's this bad. In Mexico, it's also this idea that you reach some sort of salvation, some sort of redemption, some sort of sense of understanding of your life by reaching the coast of Mexico and crossing the Pacific, which is a crossing of your life. Your life will be the crossing of a Pacific. So I brought those together, and oddly enough, it turned out to be a very easy novel to write. My usual writing process is I do lots of research. I love doing research. So I had this initial idea, boy in a lifeboat with an animal. It wasn't going to be a tiger. The very first incarnation of Richard Parker was an elephant. Now, the Indian elephant is smaller than the African elephant, and it was going to be a juvenile, an adolescent Indian elephant. So still a substantial animal, but not this hulking thing. And I abandoned the elephant because I thought it was too comic. The idea of a lifeboat with an elephant and a boy, you can sort of see this lopsided lifeboat. It seemed too comic a note, and I didn't want that. I didn't want to strike that note so insistently. And so for the longest time, Richard Parker, and I was very settled on this, Richard Parker was going to be a rhinoceros. And the reason I was very happy about that choice is the rhinoceros is the perfect animal for the literary writer to use, because nearly everyone knows what a rhinoceros is. You all know what a rhinoceros is, but I bet none of you know anything about them, really. I bet none of you know which rhinoceros has two horns, which has one horn, where they live, what their habits are. Is it a solitary animal? Is it a gregarious animal? Most people know nothing about it. So on the one hand, it's a very familiar animal, and yet a very strange one, which of course is useful for a writer, because then I can make you believe all kinds of things about it. So for example, and this is absolutely true, if you ever, I know you have a zoo here, I don't know if you have rhinoceroses, but if you do, the rhinoceros have particularly beautiful eyes, very, very expressive eyes with very long eyelashes. And that was one feature I was going to zero in on when Richard Parker was a rhinoceros. I had to abandon Richard Parker the rhinoceros because of the damning problem that rhinoceroses are herbivores. And we are talking of a castaway story in the Pacific, so I couldn't figure out how to have a herbivore survive for 227 days in the Pacific. At one point I had this idea of having a pie collecting algae that he would dry and feed to the rhinoceros, which was one of the geneses of the island. But finally it was a very repetitive thing, this culling of algae, drying of it. It was kind of a boring thing. So I finally had to let go of the rhinoceros, which is why I'm using the rhinoceros in my next novel. The Portuguese one features rhinoceros, because I did so much research on rhinoceroses, I don't want to waste all that. Writers always recycle, as cities should. Writers recycle. But so finally I realized I needed a carnivore. And then I made the very obvious choice of the biggest carnivore in India is the tiger, which initially I wasn't particularly happy about, because I thought the tiger is very well known. Most of you would know more about tigers than you do about rhinoceroses. And a tiger, to our sense of aesthetics, is a very obviously beautiful animal, whereas the beauty of the rhinoceros is a little bit more recherché. So I initially wasn't particularly pleased, but it seems to have worked out nicely. So I do research. So once I decided to bring these odd elements together of religion and zoology, I started doing research. So I was in India for 6 months, and suddenly I had a mission. I had a reason to be there. I happened to have arrived in Bombay, so I spent those 6 months in the south of India, exploring, going to all the zoos I could find in India. I interviewed the director of the Trivandrum Zoo. I went to mosques, temples, churches, even found synagogues. Spent 6 months sort of absorbing Indianness, Indian English, Indian habits. And I also started, that turned out to be fascinating as part of my research, I started reading, of course. And broadly I did 3 areas of research: animal behavior and zoo biology, religion, of course, not only the primary texts, which I'd never read, but a lot of secondary texts that explain those apparently simple primary texts, and research on castaways, how people have survived at sea each of them absolutely fascinating research. And that research gave me more ideas, which gave me more venues for research, which gave me more ideas. So for example, one element that I initially wasn't going to be in the novel was that of zoos. I just needed a tiger and various other animals in a lifeboat. I didn't really care where they came from. I just quickly wanted to get to that stage. So initially, it was going to be from a circus. But that struck me as a little bit hokey. And I didn't see why a circus would be on a cargo ship. It seemed a bit too of a stretch of credibility. So I thought, well, a zoo. But since no one likes zoos, right? Zoos are jails for animals. As it is, I'm taking on a novel about religion, and I come from a fiercely secular society. Why would I also try to take on the idea of zoos and defending them? That would be taking on two things that people in Quebec hate. Your average novel reader in Canada doesn't like zoos and doesn't like religion. So here's a novel about zoos and about religion. It's really going to damn the novel. But I did a little bit of research. Maybe he could just come to a zoo and then we quickly forget the zoo. And in doing my research, I discovered that I profoundly misunderstood. I didn't understand how good zoos operate, how animal psychology operates, principally the idea of territoriality. And I discovered that good zoos are an acceptable compromise, that they try to play with the psychology of each animal to make the level of stress that they live with acceptable, no more, no worse than it would be in nature. I mean, after all, in nature, your average gnu is predated upon by animals that want to eat it alive. And that must cause certainly a level of stress, right? Whereas in a zoo, of course, there's food comes all the time, there are no predators, and they eventually get used to that. So there the danger is the danger, for example, of boredom. Each one is a compromise. Nature is a compromise, and so is a zoo, but it's an acceptable one. What I came to discover was that zoos are like embassies from the wild. And unless we can afford to have safaris in Africa, very few of us will ever see a giraffe in the flesh unless we go to a zoo. And so if we close down all the zoos, that means in a sense we close down the embassy of the giraffes, of the Republic of the Giraffes. And the problem with that is that out of sight, out of mind. If you never actually see, especially when you're young, when you're a child, if you never see a giraffe in the flesh, you won't care for it. You won't care for it because giraffes on TV live forever. You can just watch the same nature documentaries and there's a giraffe, so they live in that virtual world which isn't the real world. Whereas if you see a real giraffe, you realize what an extraordinary, weird creature it is, and you start caring for it. And therefore, hopefully, you start caring for its environment. And that's why a zoo is like an embassy. It represents that species, and it's there to defend its republic, and hopefully you care for it. So that's the defense of the good modern zoo, is it maintains our relations with the animal world, which otherwise is completely lost. Now in the United States, and perhaps in Tennessee, maybe there's a great tradition of hunting. That is one relationship with the wild. But most people who live in large urban centers live in this very peculiar species kind of isolation. I wouldn't know in Nashville, but certainly in New York, I imagine that your average person on an average day would maybe interact with 2-3 other species. Maybe their cat and their dog, they might see a squirrel, they might see a bird, and that's it. And it's perfectly conceivable that some people would spend weeks without ever interacting with any other species but their own. And that kind of species autism is extremely peculiar. A zoo breaks that down. So I realized that I misunderstood zoos, and suddenly I said, wow, actually a zoo is a fascinating place. The way a zoo operates is as interesting as how a hospital operates. It's a very complex place. So I read a bit about zoos, became fascinated by them, and saw that I could serve my purpose. Doing that zoo research gave me the key way in which Pi could survive with a tiger. And that isn't untrue. It is conceivable that a boy could survive in a lifeboat with a tiger, given more time. What I did in Life of Pi is compress that period of adaptation. In reality, a tiger that came upon a lifeboat would be so stressed, it would rip everything apart. It would kill anything that it could reach out of sheer stress. Given time, it might adapt to its restrained territory if that territory satisfied its needs of food, shelter, water, etc. So there's an example. I did research on zoos. It gave me more ideas. I did more research. And it's something all coming together. The religious research was particularly interesting. There's one writer I'd recommend, by the way, a wonderful British writer named Karen Armstrong, who wrote a book called The History of God. absolutely fascinating book. There's a lot of interesting stuff on religion there that's enlightened and faithful and extraordinarily stimulating. And then the research on the castaways. It all came together quite nicely. I spent 6 months in India, and then I returned to Montreal, where I lived at the time. And I did about 2 more years of research. And as I do research, I write notes. And after 2 years, I had like 300 pages of notes. And then what I do is I print up those notes, I get my scissors out, and I cut them up. And then I put them in these envelopes. And the envelopes are by theme, by where they belong in the novel. So, for example, the first envelope for Life of Pi was author's note. I had gathered all the thoughts that I had for the author's note. And so the day or the week I wrote the author's note, I opened up that envelope, pulled out these little bits of paper, and they were the backbone for that first chapter, in a sense. And the second envelope would have been the first chapter, which is when Pi's in Canada, and his summary of his Canadian experience, of what he's doing in Canada, how he got there, his various little... And then I had some thematic envelopes, information on the Pacific, on the turtles of the Pacific, information on currents, on winds, on clouds. So I had these like 50 envelopes that were the backbone of the novel. And as I went through the novel, I'd open up an envelope, pull out all the notes that I had, and that was my way of starting a chapter. Because it's very hard to just sit down and out of nothing write. That's the sort of the myth of the writer who just sits down and is, possessed by creativity and just types out 300 pages. Well, maybe some writers like that. I certainly can't do that. And so I did all this research for 2 years, and it took me about 2.5 years to write. And it all came together with that magic of creativity where all these disparate elements come together nicely. And I'll explain what I was trying to do. Now, I say this, and please hold on to your own interpretation. Obviously, I wrote the book, but I'm just one of the readers. I was the first reader, but my interpretation is just mine. You're welcome to hold on to your interpretations. What Life of Pi was to me was, remember what I said about my rebellion against being overly rational. I was drying up, and I didn't want to be dried up. I didn't want to be this desiccated little computer. So Life of Pi to me was a rebellion against being excessively reasonable. So what I do in Life of Pi is I give you one set of facts. What a sweet sound. I have 2 small children. That was a baby? Oh, I have 2... I just lost track. Sorry, that reminded me of my 2 small children there. What was I talking about? I give you one set of facts. Sorry. I give you one set of facts. A ship sinks, and 227 days later, one survivor reaches the coast of Mexico. And atop of those same set of facts, 2 radically different stories are told. Of course, one with animals, and at the very end, a second story is told, one without animals, with human characters. And in a sense, those 2 stories are in competition. At the very end of the novel, the key question in the novel, Pi asks the investigators about to leave, if you remember, he says, which is the better story? He doesn't ask which is the true story, because neither of those can be proved. Both stories come through Pi. There's no other way of verifying those stories. Much as in stories of religion, they can't prove them. There is an act of faith involved in accepting someone's story. There's no way of verifying it. So all the stories of religion, you can't verify them. You have to make a leap of faith. In this same thing here with Life of Pi, Pi presents the investigators 2 stories. They can't verify either one of them. So he asks them, which is the better story? And the younger investigator, who's more willing to make leaps of faith, less bound by reason, immediately says the story with animals, and the older one also agrees. So they finally agree that the story with animals is the better one. And then Pi says this line, and so it goes with God. So what I was attempting to do there, and it's not a reasoning, it's not a process that necessarily all readers will get, but that line in the author's note where this old man says, I have a story that will make you believe in God. That wasn't just a throwaway line. It wasn't a claim proven by the fact that Pi overcomes great adversity in the Pacific. Overcoming suffering proves nothing. Talk to Holocaust survivors. The fact that they went through hell doesn't prove anything. It just made them broken human beings. That proves nothing. The idea is that our reading of reality is highly subjective. We can't choose what we are, where we are, what happens to us, but we can always absolutely control how we interpret things. And that goes beyond just, what do you think of this restaurant meal? Is it good or not? At a deeper level, we co-create our reality. Imagination plays an absolutely vital, functional role in how we understand reality. And proven, for example, a very banal way by a book that two people have read. One person will love it, one person will hate it. Well, they've read the same book. It's the same reality, but they interpret it differently because they've brought different things to it. A book is only 50%. The other percent is what the reader brings to it. That portion of the imagination, and that changes the reality of that book. And the same thing of a nation, of your nation. Your nation is not just a constitution and a series of facts. It is how you feel about it, and how you feel about it will change what it is. So in this contest of ideas, of stories, Pi asks investigators, which do you choose? And the younger one says, the story with animals is the better story. And my argument, and I said it's a radical departure from my thought process for most of my life, was that in a sense, religious thinking, a reading of life that has transcendental elements, is a richer one, is the better story, over one that is flatly materialistic and chemical. You can, as a hardcore atheist, argue that we're just the result of happenstance and chemistry, and it all means nothing. We're just a little thing floating in the universe and absolutely of no significance. You can totally believe that, and you have to make the consequence. You have to live a life that takes that into account. It's a fairly bleak ending to your life. You're just going to die, and that's it, darkness. And when there's appalling suffering, there's nothing you can do. It sucks, and you have to suck it up, and that's it. So you have to live a very brave life, in a sense, if you want to be a radical atheist. But my argument is, why do that? What do you gain from it? That radical rationalism, I'm not sure when you're 79 years old and dying of cancer in your bed and your stomach's bloated like this and your legs are two little sticks, I'm not sure what you gain by being so hidebound reasonable. We want our children to read. Why? Because it nourishes their imagination. Well, as adults, why do we not want to nourish our imagination? Which is not to say that religion is just a product of the imagination, not at all. But why would we want to make more of things rather than less? So the argument, I believe, is that some kind of transcendental vision is the better story. It demands a leap of faith. It demands you to stop being reasonable. And so, for example, with getting back to Life of Pi, the argument, the narrative process I took, and this will explain, by the way, the most common question I get is about the island. People always ask me about the island. What I wanted to do in telling Life of Pi is, in the first story with animals, start with an improbable premise and make it more and more improbable. So I'll start with the premise, will you believe that a boy could survive in a lifeboat with a tiger? Well, because of everything that I have in part one, where animal behavior is explained, hopefully you get on board. In a sense, literally, you get on board. You will accept that the boy can survive with the tiger. You've already made that leap of faith. They say, okay, good, well, I'll push you a bit further. Will you believe that the boy will go blind and the tiger will go blind and they'll meet another blind person in another lifeboat? I mean, how likely is that? Two lifeboats bumping into each other in the middle of the Pacific, the largest ocean on Earth. Well, there are ocean currents, ships take, they don't just wander any which way, they take lanes. So it is possible, and because there hasn't been much dialogue until then, and it's sort of strange, surreal dialogue between the blind Frenchman and Pi, you stay on board. You'll believe. Maybe you're starting to think, well, this is getting a bit weird, a bit surreal, but I'm enjoying this, so I'll keep on going. And then my hope was that you would get to the island. And at the island, the reader would say, whoa, this I can no longer believe. Meerkats, carnivorous algae, no. And then you'd say, well, this must be some complicated symbol that Yann Martel intended that I don't get, but whatever. The island's kind of interesting, so I'll keep on reading. And that was the great challenge with the island, was it had to be unbelievable, but still interesting. And that's a huge challenge, because usually in fiction, once something becomes unbelievable, it also becomes uninteresting. You're suddenly saying, oh God, I thought it was this, but it's this, and I'm no longer interested, and you stop reading. So the challenge with the island was to make it unbelievable that you would say, whoa, I don't get this, but you'd still keep on reading. Hence the meerkats. There's no deep symbolism as far as I meant to the meerkats. They're just funny little animals that are gregarious, that have funny little habits, like standing like this, always on guard. They're weird little animals that I hope people would like. Initially, I was going to use a mongoose, but a mongoose is actually quite an aggressive animal, whereas a meerkat is not. It's this just a strange little animal that I thought people, just by sheer cuteness, would keep you reading. And also the way the island's laid out and all these things, I just hope would keep you reading. Then you'd get to the end of that part, the story with animals. Get to part 3 where Pi is pushed by the investigators, by these rationalists, and he wants his suffering accepted. As anyone who's suffered, who relates their suffering, they want their suffering accepted. They're not accepting his first story, so therefore he comes up with his second story where he substitutes the animals. He replaces them with human characters in the hope that these investigators will accept that. Well, I wanted that story to be so repelling, so barbarous, that you would go back to the first story. But if you're going to do that, you'd have to accept the island. You'd have to say, well, what do I know about meerkats? What do I know about algae? And the fact is, what do you know about algae in Nashville, Tennessee? What do you know about meerkats? Nothing. So, okay, I'll go for it. I'll accept the meerkat. So, in other words, make a leap of faith. Stop always being reasonable, make a leap of faith, and be the better for it. You know, the first story is satisfying in some ways, and it's not some sort of delusion. I mean, I remind, read letters from rationalists who write to me saying the first story is an illusion, is a fable. I remind them that in both stories, Pi's family dies. In both stories, he suffers appalling suffering. Either way, he's out in the Pacific for 227 days, which entails a lot of suffering. In both cases, his family dies. So it's not a question of making that suffering go away. Just one is a more sort of satisfying reading, but it demands that you let go of your reason. So that's the narrative strategy I had with the island. It was to float just beyond the horizon of reasonableness and ask you to jump, to make that leap of faith. And it's interesting that I get a lot of letters, especially from Americans. You're very chatty, friendly people. So I get a lot of letters from Americans, and they broadly, interestingly fall into two categories. You have the rationalists who read the novel, get to the second story and go, aha, this is what really happened. And the story with animals is Pi inventing this story to make acceptable what he can't accept, the killing of his mother. And I suppose he's alone now, so he tells himself stories to pass the time, and that explains the story with animals. But really what happened is he was stuck on this lifeboat with his mother, with this Taiwanese sailor with a broken leg, and this barbaric French cook. And then the other people are the ones who read it and get to the second story, and as I said, say, oh, I don't really like this story. I much prefer the first one. And then, in a sense, don't ask themselves too many questions. Just believe the first story and say, well, I prefer that one. And that one's told for another reason, and they ignore it. And the letters have broadly reflected those two sort of readings of the book. And the movie, for those of you who've seen the movie, in many ways it's faithful. Obviously it helps if you read the book before you see the movie, because you can fill in all the things that are absent in the movie. Because the movie can only tell so much from a book. I mean, the novel's 330 pages. You can say a lot of things in 330 pages. A screenplay is maybe 100 pages long, all dialogue. And there's only so much thinking that you can represent visually. Subtle religious thinking cannot be portrayed visually. So there's a lot missing in the movie, but it does a marvelous job of capturing all the stuff in the Pacific. But in the movie, I thought the second story was a little bit rushed. Those of you who read the book, who've seen it, would understand it, but those who haven't, who just happen to see this movie called Life of Pi, not having read the book, I doubt would fully understand the interplay of those two stories in the book. I don't want to go on for too long. I want to questions. Why don't we open up for questions? And I'm happy to answer any sort of questions. Yes, sir.
Is Pi the number a critical element in developing the character and related to your embracing the futility of rationality? And second part, where are you in your journey with that frustration over rationality today?
Wow, what a simple question. That's such a long, intelligent, complicated question. I've already practically forgotten it. Okay, Pi. I'll answer the question about Pi. everything I chose, I write carefully because it's fun. I take my time writing, so everything is meant for some reason. So pi, as you know, is what's called in mathematics an irrational number. So it's a number that repeats itself with no discernible pattern. Pi goes on for millions of digits with no discernible pattern. It's called irrational number. It just struck me that science uses this irrational number and other numbers all the time to make sense of things. So it's interesting, we use irrational numbers to get to a rational understanding of things. In my mind, religion does the same thing. Religion is in many ways irrational, but it helps make sense of life. Very much so. So it was that echoing. There's also the idea, I like the fact that Pi was his nickname. His full name is Piscine Molitor Patel, which happened to be a swimming pool I used to go to all the time when I was a kid in France. It was in Paris. It was a lovely, lovely pool. And I also like the idea that a swimming pool normally is a rectangular space, right? It's a logical space. You don't make a pool with all the fun, and now you do in these resorts, these really weird, it's very hard to do lengths, to go do laps when your pool is shaped like an amoeba. A rectangular shape is a reasonable, logical, efficient space for a volume of water. I like the idea of this boy named after a rectangular volume of water being stuck in the Pacific, a profoundly irrationally shaped volume of water. So I like playing with these contrasts. Same thing with the choice of the number 227. I wanted that's a prime number. A prime number is a number that's divisible only by itself, by 227, or by 1. You can't divide it by 2 or 3 or anything else. That's called a prime number. And I wanted that because I didn't want people, and some readers still manage to do it, I didn't want people to have sort of the cafeteria approach, that they pick this from that story and that from that story. I didn't want them to be able to divide the story up. I want you to take one story or the other whole. So I just arbitrarily chose a prime number. And prime numbers aren't that frequent once you get beyond the lower ones. So I just happened to choose 2, because otherwise it was too short or too long. And it's one of the serendipitous things of creativity. So I chose 227 days, and I can't remember why, but I had Pi leave on the summer solstice. And the summer solstice plus 227 days brings you to February 14th, Valentine's Day, which I kind of liked. And also a reader pointed out to me, and I never thought of this, that 22/7 is a rough representation of pi. And I didn't realize that. So all those things were intended. As for the question about rationality, yes, all the books I've written have transformed me. So now I'm still intolerant of the intolerance of religion. The Catholic Church in the United States, same thing in Canada too as in Europe, the excesses of the Catholic Church, for example, the abuse of children, is beyond comprehension. How people who should every day be talking and practicing God's love should, hide away priests who are pedophiles. I don't understand that, and I hate it as much. Being the father of 2 small children with a third on the way, I absolutely hate that in the church, that it's become an organization full of organization men. And the sight of 117 old men who are going to choose another old man who will rule the destiny of, half the Catholics are supposed to be women, rule the destiny of Catholic women. That sort of sexism outrages me. But having said that, I see now that there's something grander afoot in religion than these petty prejudices that sometimes are expressed in organized religion. So now, in a sense, I love religion. While I was doing, it was a very odd thing, because as I said, initially I wanted a character who had faith, but I was on the outside. I was sort of like Jane Goodall looking at her chimpanzees. Well, just as Jane Goodall fell in love with her chimpanzees, I, in a sense, fell in love with my subject matter. And whether it's Christianity or Hinduism or Islam, they all have extraordinarily positive aspects. They're all very different, sort of like the foods of the world. Indian food is different from Italian food. They both can nourish the stomach. Every religion can nourish the soul. I don't believe in any exclusive. To me, it's incomprehensible that there's so many religions on this earth. If any one religion was absolutely true, that means all the other ones are false. And in good conscience, I cannot imagine a Christian going to India and telling 1.1 billion Hindus, you're all wrong. And vice versa. That's where I just let go. I don't understand this. There'll be some explanation eventually. But I love to me, religion is a socio-cultural phenomenon. It is a human capacity to understand what is beyond our capacity to understand, which explains the errors and the differences. But I've gone a 180-degree turn now from thinking religion was of no interest to me, it's the most fascinating way to look at life. Whether you believe or not, But, the way religions operate, Islam, I was very grateful to Ang Lee to have that scene in the movie where you have Pi going, Allahu Akbar, looking straight at the camera and praying, and he's not about to set off a bomb. He just loves Allah and he's praying. The way Islam is practiced, that communal way of praying, you go to a country where you have, a mosque with 300 people, and they do it all together at the same time. You bend over at the same time, you genuflect at the same time. It's breathtaking. It's extraordinary, the energy. It's like when you do yoga in a group. It gives off this energy. When you have a whole bunch of Muslims praying together, it gives off a charge that's really impressive. And also the way it works itself out, the beliefs and all that, I find it fascinating. So now I feel in my own life I've put reason into proper perspective. Of course it's a wonderful tool. I have a digital watch right here. I work on a computer. I love that. So I believe in rationality, but only as a tool. It's like a very good screwdriver. But now, you need to have a reason to hold your screwdriver. And that has to be some kind of faith, whether religious, romantic, political, your favorite football team. You need to have just something you feel for, and then you use rationality to serve that faith. So I'm no longer that dried up little man I was before I wrote Life of Pi. Another question. Lady right there. Can you just wait for the mic, because then apparently it's easier. It's coming.
Thank you for being here. So you went to India in search of writing this first novel, and now that you have 2 small children, I'm imagining you're not rushing off across the globe to write your next novel. So what is your process of writing like now, or do you take a time to separate from the family and have your own space, or what's your day-to-day writing like?
That's a great question. Well, the novel I'm working on now, this Portuguese novel, my partner is English, and we go every Christmas to England to visit her family. And the last 2 years, I've taken 10 days to go off to Portugal. Now, northern Portugal in December is like, Nashville on March 2nd, 2013. It's miserable weather. It's cold. It's damp. It just so happens that in this particular novel, I don't need to do as much research on the ground. Although I say that, I'd love to go to a small former Portuguese colony called São Tomé. São Tomé and Príncipe. It's the second smallest country in Africa. It's off the western equatorial coast of Africa. I'd love to go there. I don't know if I'll manage it. I do with my research, same sort of thing of research notes, cutting them up and all that. This one is more a product of my imagination, it so happens. But so I do occasionally have to do trips. But in fact, I hate it. Now, you create children, they become a new world, and you want to stay in that little world. And the outer world still remains interesting, but it's in competition with this inner world of children. So I do take time off for some trips, but not too many. For example, here in Nashville, unfortunately, I'd love to stay here longer. I arrived last night, I'm leaving tomorrow morning. I'm on a short leash because my partner's 7.5 months pregnant. So if I stay any longer, she'll be so upset and so angry, and I don't want to live for that. So yes, gentleman there. Just wait for the mic.
You told 2 stories, and Pi's 3 religions tell 3 stories that kind of go to the same end where he can love God. Is that why you told two stories? And which one did you, as a novelist and the first reader, pick as your story? The one with the animals?
Definitely the one with animals. I wouldn't have, I spent, 100 pages, 150 pages telling the first story, only 7 the second. Very much the first one. And by the way, I should explain why I have practiced 3 religions. That wasn't just some fancy I had. Everything was tactical in a sense. Initially, I thought that Pi, being Indian, of course, would be Hindu. But my problem with that as a Canadian writer is most novel readers from the West know very little about Hinduism, because we're not Hindus, there's not. So I thought therefore Hinduism would be merely folkloric. So I didn't want that. I wanted it to be something that people would take more seriously, readers would take more seriously. So I thought, well, I'll have them be Christian. There is a large Christian minority, large. It's about 35 million, which is like the population of Canada, but it's nothing in the enormous continent that is India. But my problem, and that's coming from where I come from, a character who says, Jesus says, immediately turns everyone off in Canada, because you imagine, fanatical American evangelical who's going to pull out a gun and kill the doctor. So because of the kidnapping of Christianity and the errors of the churches and the errors of individual believers, it's not an attractive character to have someone who... And I said, Canada's a very secular country. In Canada, if you quote Jesus once, you're making an erudite literary reference. Do it a second time, people are a bit puzzled. You do it a third time, they think you're you're weird. So that was a problem. Do you want the reader to suspend their disbelief and continue reading? And of course, if I'd only be a Muslim, well, that's even worse, of course. So I finally realized I'll have them practice all three to point out that I'm not really interested in organized religion, but what's at the core of every religion, which is some kind of faith. And also, it's not something I just invented. You do see, interestingly enough, in rural parts of India, you do see Hindu peasants who on their way, home, especially in the southwest in Kerala, where there's a number of Christians, if you go to a Christian church in Kerala, you will often see broken up bits of coconut and flowers at the foot of statues. In a Christian church, in a Catholic church or Protestant, there'll be statues of various saints, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Thomas, whatever. You will see flowers and coconuts, and that doesn't make sense in a Christian context. We don't make offerings to sculptures in Christianity. In Hinduism, you do. In Hinduism, gods are represented, they're called murtis. They're incarnations of the gods. And just as we need to be dressed and bathed and fed, so do the gods. So the murti in a Hindu temple will be bathed, will be fed. You make offerings of food, will be clothed. And it's not some sort of turning God into Barbie doll. It's this idea that we must take care of God. And the murti at the center of a Hindu temple, it's a very, very special place. And so there's this carryover onto Christian spaces done by some unsophisticated Hindus in rural areas. Well, they'll go into church. In a sense, what they're doing is they're covering all their bases. They're going to church and they sense that they can't get to the crucifix. That's sort of in this forbidden space. But there's all these sculptures, so they're mock offerings. So in a sense, these Hindus are taking on Christianity as an extension of Hinduism. So they're becoming, in a sense, rudimentary Christians. So I noted that, and I'd read about that. And so I said, well, here's an example of him pushing that even further. Yeah, you.
Thank you.
Wait, let's get the mic, sorry. No, not at all.
Thank you. Thank you. Good projection. What was the process like for you as the author to see your very wonderful and well-received book then progress on to become a screenplay and then on to the film? Did you have much control or voice in that process? Mm-hmm. And then to see it then nominated for an Academy Award. What was that process like for you? And did you go to the Oscars?
Yeah, I'll tell you my Oscar story. I was minimally involved. Hollywood is always looking for stories. It's like a vacuum cleaner for stories. Many would just end up on shelves and nothing happens. They buy an option, they'll renew the option, then they might buy it and then nothing will happen. So very early on, Life of Pi was bought, but because of the difficulties in adapting it, technical difficulties to start with, but also storytelling difficulties, the novel is very scattered. It doesn't have that unity of time, action, and place that traditionally serves well for a story. It's, parts taken in India, part in the Pacific, part in Mexico, part in Toronto. It's very scattered. So there's those storytelling challenges, but also the technical challenges. It was a lot of work. So what happened is the studio, various directors got involved, sniffed around, and various reasons had to let go. So that was sort of happening while my life went on. I wrote another novel, Beatrice and Virgil. I wrote 101 letters to the Prime Minister of Canada. I have 2 children. It was always in the background sort of happening. One day it was going to be M. Night Shyamalan, one day it was going to be Alfonso Cuarón, another day it was going to be Jean-Pierre Jeunet, the French director who did Amélie. And then finally it was Ang Lee, and Hollywood is like a tightrope, and to make a movie you have to have 1,000 people who are on that tightrope at the same time. And they always seem to fall off, and suddenly they're all on, and suddenly it's like a broad stage, and they're all there, and there's no problems, and the movie suddenly gets done very quickly. So once Ang Lee got on board, it started happening. I was very happy with it in a sense that I love cinema. I grew up on movies, and I love cinema, and I believe in artistic risks, and also in a purely self-interested way, you never blame the author of a book for the bad movie that might be done based on his book. So if it had been a terrible movie, I could have said, well, it was his movie. And if it's a great movie, I could say, well, hey, I wrote the book. So either way, I would win. But even if it had been a bad movie, I do like movies. The cinema is, I think, probably the dominant art form of the 20th century, certainly in the West. All of us have dozens of scenes that we could remember, from a movie of something bursting through the screen. So I was willing to take that risk. I think the movie is very strong in many ways. I think Ang Lee probably took on a little bit too much. He tried to do everything: India, the Pacific, Montreal. He wasn't interested in Toronto, he wanted to be Montreal. I think the ending, the second story, comes a little bit too quickly, kind of out of nowhere. I had proposed to him that the framing device for the movie be the interrogation between Pi and the investigators in Mexico. So the movie starts in Mexico in some little clinic with these, and I was going to propose an American and a Mexican investigators. To allow, first of all, a big American actor, Jack Nicholson with some young Mexican. So it gives, because after all, you have to have star appeal, that might help, because otherwise you're featuring, as the movie does, all these unknowns. Anyway, that was my idea, and that they would meet in Mexico, and that the framing device be this, basically part 3 of the novel, this interrogation between Pi and these investigators, and you have a long flashback to the Pacific, with perhaps the odd one in India. But basically, simplify, eliminate, because a novel has too much in it. But it's still a lovely movie. I love the whole Pacific part. I just love watching that lifeboat with the tiger and Pi in it. The Oscars, well, that was an odd thing. It was a sort of a rude recall of where the writer is in Hollywood. My agent had to sort of cajole Hollywood into inviting me. I was in a hotel that was kind of far away. The day of, there was a limo and driven by this Russian guy named Sergei, who spoke about 20 words of English. And we started driving, and very quickly, it's bizarre, a huge chunk of LA is, dedicated to the Oscars on the day of, so only limos can go there. And very quickly, security were telling Sergei, you don't have the blue permit, they're going to stop you. And Sergei said, yeah, okay, and kept on driving. And at one point, sure enough, security said, you don't have your blue permit. At which point, Sergei turned around and said, you go to Oscars? And I say, no. I wasn't invited, actually. Thank you for reminding me of that. I'm not invited to the Oscars, Sergei. I was invited to what's called a viewing party. All the studios that have movies that are nominated organize these viewing parties where sort of everyone who's involved in a movie who's not going to the Oscars can go and see it. And it's sort of been built up to me that it was really glamorous and it was a really fun thing. Well, in fact, it kind of sucked. I ended up watching the Oscars sitting between a couple who worked in commercial real estate in Northern California, a very sweet couple, and a man who worked in the medical health industry. Very nice man, but complete strangers. And my partner, Alice, he was very chatty and gregarious, ended up chatting them up. And so they eventually found out that I happened to have written the book. So every time Life of Pi won an Oscar, they'd turn around and say, hey, congratulations, that's terrific. And they had their picture taken with me. And it was great. But so when Ang Lee stood up there and thanked me, the first thing he did is thank me. I said, great, well, you could have invited me to the goddamn Oscars. So it was kind of humiliating, especially with the limo thing, too, because we were so far in there that to get us out of that column of 1,000 limos, we had to sort of drive out, back up. They had to move the fences, the barricades, and it was like you're really not going to the Oscars here. You're really not. So it was kind of disappointing, but in the pyramid that is Hollywood, the writer is quite far down the food chain, because it's such a complicated process that to write, there was once upon a time there was a boy in a lifeboat with a tiger. It takes 5 seconds to write. To bring that to the screen is so complicated that the little guy who just wrote the words, that's so easy. You try filming that, it's so difficult that they sort of push you down. So the director is top of the food chain, obviously. The cinematographer, the guy who actually figures out the camera angles, is very high up. All these people are higher up. So no one in Fox thought really of saying, well, maybe we should invite the guy who wrote the book to the Oscars. They wanted, it's very hard to get tickets. Everyone wants to go. Members of the Academy can go. Nominees go. Previous winners can go. So I didn't get a seat. So the Oscars in LA. LA is great. I had a wonderful day with Alice in LA. We went to LACMA, the LA County Museum of Art, which is a fabulous museum. So I had a great time in LA. The Oscars was kind of like, wasn't a great experience. Yeah, gentleman right there.
Two quick questions. One is the character of Tiger. He's a character that Pi cannot live with because he's going to eat Pi, and he's also a character that Pi cannot live without. Without the tiger, the Pi will lose inspiration to continue to live.
Mm.
Do you mean this tiger character to depict things in our lives which we cannot live with, we cannot live without? Second question is, I found your conversion, a change from rational person to be willing to adapt irrational things, interesting. And do you think that comes about in your life as a result of suffering in your life, maybe seeing the irrational things in our lives, and also is a result of just one gets older, the approaching of mortality?
Great questions. First one about Richard Parker. That's one of the odd things that I discovered with the success of the book. My concern writing the book were in a sense purely technical. The Statue of Liberty the engineering was done by Gustave Eiffel, the same man who did the Eiffel Tower. I felt in a sense like Gustave Eiffel erecting the Statue of Liberty. My only concern was that the statue not fall over, that her head not fall off, that the arms stay up. My concerns were internal. So for Life of Pi, I was concerned that the novel, that the story be credible, that the tiger's behavior be credible, that the little details about the turtles in the Pacific be credible, so that you would believe. But what the Statue of Liberty would look like from the outside was not my concern. So it was a very odd feeling. I felt like a complete fraud. When the book started becoming successful and I started doing readings and I'd get questions, people would say, "So, Richard Parker, what does he symbolize?" And I had absolutely nothing to say. I'd never thought of it. So I started getting wonderful answers from perceptive readers who said, well, perhaps Richard Parker represents God, because after all, we're afraid of God. Often, especially in the Old Testament, there's a fear of God, but at the same time, he's a comfort, which is exactly what Richard Parker is. So I thought, well, that's very clever. So the next time I was asked a question, I'd say, well, Richard Parker could be a representation of God, Or another reader pointed out, because after all, Richard Parker is not the tiger's real name. The tiger's real name is Thirsty. And so there's a name change, and readers pointed out, it's very interesting, because, Paul of Tarsus, the Apostle Paul, his name wasn't Paul, his name was Saul. Many of the disciples changed names, so is that why Richard Parker changes his name? I said, that's very interesting. And so in a sense, I have channeled all the perceptive, subjective readings of the novel back to the readers. Richard Parker will be what you want him to be. He could be Pi himself, a nano, as something that does not want to die no matter what and does its utmost to survive. There's many possibilities who he could be. In a sense, that's not my concern. I have one reading, you can have your own. I didn't intend one in particular. I knew the animal would symbolize something. I hadn't worked out what in particular. So I tell you, the first questions, the times I was asked that question, and I didn't know what to say. I felt like, God, I'm such a fraud here. Surely I should have thought of that, but I really didn't. It was a very odd thing. And your second question was, sorry, what was it about something about rationality?
The second question is, I find your own change from being
why I came to it.
irrational.
Well, yes, maybe not undue suffering. I've been very lucky in my life to be spared, appalling suffering. It is a question of age. As I said earlier, it was a question of being tired of being reasonable. I believe in magical thinking, in art, in religion, in economics, in anything. So it was in a sense to defend my sense of the imagination and that role it plays in my life. So that is perhaps a result of getting older. It's very easy to be very rational when you're young, healthy, and wealthy. It's when your mortality starts knocking on the door that you start realizing that, health is temporary and wealth is an illusion. Yes?
You've mentioned Beatrice and Virgil a few times. This is a question about that book. I really enjoyed it, but I felt like it ended so suddenly. It sort of haunted me. I haven't been able to stop thinking about that. And I wondered, I've come up with my own theories, if the structure of the book sort of mirrored the way that lives were cut short too soon in the Holocaust. But I kind of made that up, and I was wondering if you could...
That sounds like a very good interpretation. I'll have to remember that. That could be a whole other lecture. Really very quickly, I don't want to drag this on too long. Beatrice and I'm not Jewish, I'm not of Polish, German, Hungarian descent. Historically, I have nothing to do with that tragedy, but it's one that has always struck me. When you're a kid and you're being taught history, you start putting things together to simplify things. So in a sense, all wars are the same. You just change the characters and maybe the reason. But essentially, the phenomenon of war is very easy for a child to understand. After all, I have a brother, therefore I understand war. Children play war. But and this was when I was living in France, when I was taught the Holocaust, it didn't fit. Children don't play Holocaust. There was an oddity as a historical event to the Holocaust that just stayed with me. And beyond just the tragedy of it, war is tragic too. There's just an oddity of, war, you kill your enemy. But in the Holocaust, you kill your neighbor who, makes good bread, or who works for you, or you work for him. Why would you kill your neighbor? Why would you kill a productive citizen of your own country? I didn't quite get it. And an interest in the Holocaust always stayed with me. And so throughout my life, I've sort of periodically read about the Holocaust, seen the movies, read the books that come out. And I was struck by something that, unlike other historical events, once again, this has to do with the intersection of art and history. Art, throughout time, has taken reality and changed it, molded it, turned it into fiction to tell the truth. So a great novel may be a complete invention of fact, but it's absolutely true spiritually. So as I said, you want to know about Russia in the 19th century, read great Russian novelists, and you will understand the Russian soul. The Holocaust as a historical event has resisted the appeal of art, especially the literary arts. You do not get Holocaust comedies. You don't get Holocaust, science fictions. Someone said Avatar is a bit like that, but it has, most Holocaust novels are in fact thinly disguised biographies or autobiographies. There's very little invention in Holocaust fiction. Now, I understand why. People say it's an appalling event, but I remind people, 6 million innocent people died during the Holocaust. The Second World War, the First World War the Second World War cost the lives, forgetting Jewish deaths and forgetting the Axis deaths, the Germans and the Italians, cost the lives of 20 million Europeans. 20 million. And yet we do have war comedies. We do use war as a background to tell a romance, to tell a thriller, in addition to the real-life documentaries. So we allow our imaginations to play with war in a way we never allow ourselves to do it with the Holocaust. And I find that there's a danger to that. To always talk about the Holocaust in the same vein of historical realism is to basically limit how we look at the Holocaust. And that can't be good. Because after all, war comedies, let's say Catch-22, is not just using the Second World War as an excuse for a laugh, it's another way of looking at things. Humor is another tool of analysis to look at things. So to eliminate comedies in discussing a particular historical event is to mean we're not going to get to the conclusions that comedy can give us. And the same thing, with other things, romance or whatever. I'll give you a concrete example. The Spanish Civil War, appalling tragedy where the Spaniards butchered each other. For most people, means nothing, but there's a fantastic mural by Picasso called Guernica. It's an astonishing thing. Well, it's all an invention, but it has managed to symbolize that war, to capture it, even though all the elements are a fiction. And this little obscure village in the Basque Country that was bombed by the fascists has remained now because of the power of art. And I believe in art because most people have a limited knowledge of history. There's too much history out there. There's your own country, and that's many, many histories. It's such a big country. Then there's all the other countries of the world. It's too much to hold. What's fantastic about art is that it can very quickly capture the essence of something. I'll give you a very concrete example. Animal Farm by George Orwell, which I mentioned in the novel. It's about Stalinism. It's about the effects of Stalinism on Russia. Now, most of us, know very little about Stalin. Most of us couldn't know when he was born, when exactly he died. We have a vague idea he's one of these big evil people of the 20th century. But our knowledge, as Americans, as Canadians, of Stalin is pretty minimal. And that's all right, because we're not Russians, but there's a danger in forgetting too much of our history, because otherwise, as Voltaire famously said, we'll repeat that history. And one way to rescue the essence of history is through art. So Animal Farm is all about Stalinism in Russia, but told in this delightful, delightful fable about this farm with these animals who set up this perfect commune, run along the lines of animalism, and it's how things go wrong because of coercion, propaganda. It captures what happens to the Russians, which otherwise you need to read like 10 books of 1,000 pages each to fully understand. Well, you capture the essence of what happened in barely 80 pages. And still to this day, kids and adults are reading Animal Farm, whereas very few of us are reading tomes on the history of Russia under Stalin. So in a sense, art is the lifeboat of history. And I'm afraid that the Holocaust is becoming too historical. It's getting stuck in black and white movies with people wearing an old style of clothing. We're forgetting that the Holocaust is completely contemporary. The thought process of hatred and dehumanizing the other is very much alive today. Now, thank God we have mechanisms we have freedom of press, we have generally a professional police force, we have responsible, all the things that failed in Germany. But those things aren't always fail-proof. And to remind us of the need for tolerance, of accepting the other, even if we don't like that other, we need to be reminded of that, and art does that very well. And I don't think we're allowing ourselves that freedom to, quote unquote, play with the Holocaust. David Grossman, a wonderful Israeli novelist, he wrote a novel called Sea Under Love, as in dictionary looking at the word love. And he was excoriated by some of his fellow writers in Israel because he has one scene, the main character in Sea Under Love cannot die. You shoot him, it hurts a lot, but then he stays alive. And so he's in the death chamber, he's in a gas chamber. And no one had done that before, where the fiction writer goes into there. That was sort of this inner sanctum which was only reserved for nonfiction. So he had his character go in there, and he doesn't die because he can't die. He's unkillable. And so he portrayed, and he was, even though he's Jewish and he's the children of Holocaust survivors, he was said, you've gone too far there. You've gone too far there. And I'm saying, are you crazy? Fiction writers go precisely where the historian cannot go. We use our imaginations to intuit a situation. It doesn't matter if it's not true. It just has to feel true. It has to convey that human spirit. And so if we don't allow ourselves that, I'm afraid that the Holocaust is going to sink as sort of this historical event from long ago. And I think that is indeed happening. And there's this kind of Holocaust fatigue that I think sometimes people feel, whereas you never feel this war fatigue. If I said I was writing a war novel, people say, oh, where? What war? What's the tone of it? Is it a comedy? Is it a metaphor for a couple divorcing? It could be anything. A war novel could be absolutely anything. Whereas, and I tell people I'm writing a novel about the Holocaust, and I would always sense a slight hunkering down of, okay, we'll do it. This will be my Holocaust novel of the decade. And and they'd ask me, I didn't know you were Jewish. Well, no, I'm not Jewish. Do only Jews? Can only women write about feminism? Can only women write about rape? Can only African Americans write about slavery? Surely we're all concerned. And so that was the reason I wrote that. I tried to apply fiction writing, the rules of it, to the Holocaust. Hence these talking animals, Beatrice and Virgil, one's a donkey, one's a monkey. I tried to sort of invent about the Holocaust rather than just bear direct witness. But it proved very hard. There's something very story-killing about genocide. I don't mean that in a glib sense. I mean, for example, one thing that goes right away out the door with a genocide is suspense. One of the tools of a story is suspense. You don't know how it's going to end. Well, if it's a genocide, obviously, if you're going to be true to the spirit of a genocide, a lot of people have to die. So already suspense is gone. Also, a key character in storytelling is character. A story is based on characters meeting and something happening. Well, genocide is nothing about character. It's not just bad Jews who were killed by the Germans, it's any Jew. You could be good, bad, beautiful, ugly, rich, poor, it doesn't matter, you were Jewish. So your personality didn't matter. Which is why, oddly enough, this cult of Anne Frank, who luckily happened to be an attractive young girl, well, she wasn't killed because she was an attractive young girl. She was killed because she was Jewish, which meant very little to her. She was not a religious Jew. So there's something deep personalitizing about the Holocaust. Same thing with the killers. A Nazi, whether a Nazi liked Wagner or not, didn't matter. He was there to kill Jews. So how do you tell a story where the character, the personality of the characters does not matter? It's very hard. So there's a lot of things that kill storytelling in the Holocaust. So anyway, Beatrice it's my hardest book I ever wrote. Not because it's long, it's not long, but it's ungrateful ground to try to discuss the Holocaust other than that historical way. We're getting on too late. So listen, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for Nashville Reads. You've got a wonderful program. Invite another Canadian next year.